Federal records from 1847 show that Inspector William Hartwell disappeared while investigating suspicious death rates along Mississippi's Natchez Trace. His final telegram sent from Natchez on October 15th reported finding systematic brutalities beyond documentation at 7 plantations owned by the wealthiest families in the district. What authorities discovered 3 weeks later when they finally located his abandoned carriage near Orban Mansion would expose the most disturbing conspiracy in antebellum Southern history. For over 8 years, a secret society of plantation mistresses had been operating what they called correctional exchanges, a network that allowed them to share enslaved men between properties for increasingly sadistic punishments. The evidence was so horrifying that Governor Albert Gallatin Brown ordered all documentation sealed, and for over 150 years, the truth about the Natchez district remained buried in government archives. The death toll exceeded 200 men, their bodies found in unmarked graves scattered across 7 properties, each bearing evidence of systematic torture that defied contemporary understanding of human cruelty. Before we continue with the story of Inspector Hartwell's investigation and what he uncovered in those grand mansions along the Mississippi River, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss our dark historical mysteries. And tell us in the comments, what state are you listening from? We love hearing from our viewers around the country. The autumn of 1847 would forever change how we understand the hidden cruelties of slavery in America's wealthiest region, revealing depths of human depravity that challenge belief even today. The Natchez District in 1847 represented the pinnacle of Southern wealth and power, a 30-mile stretch along the Mississippi River's eastern bank where cotton was literally worth more than gold. This region boasted more millionaires per capita than anywhere else in America, with individual plantation owners commanding fortunes that exceeded entire northern cities. Grand mansions like Auburn, Melrose, and Stanton Hall dominated landscapes of endless cotton fields, their Greek Revival columns and manicured gardens concealing brutal realities that sustained such impossible opulence. The climate itself seemed designed to amplify human suffering. Mississippi summers reached brutal temperatures that could kill a working man in hours, while winters brought bone-chilling dampness that penetrated the flimsy slave quarters like icy fingers. The Spanish moss that draped ancient oak trees created an atmosphere of perpetual twilight, muffling sounds and casting strange shadows that made even daylight hours feel ominous. The Mississippi River, brown with sediment and treacherous with hidden currents, had claimed countless lives over the decades, making it an ideal location for disposing of inconvenient evidence. At the center of this world stood 7 families whose names commanded absolute respect throughout the South. The Vandenbergs of Elmwood Plantation, the Dabneys of Riverside Estate, the Pembrokes of Magnolia Grove, the Vanderhosts of Cedar Hill, the Fairfaxes of Willowmere, the Hawthors of Oakwood Manor, and the Belmonteses of Roslyn Plantation. These families had intermarried for generations, creating an insular aristocracy that considered itself above both law and moral scrutiny. Their wealth derived not just from cotton, but from strategic investments in steamboat companies, New Orleans banks, and northern textile mills that processed their raw materials. The women of these families, Charlotte Vandenberg, Elena Dabney, Victoria Pembroke, Constance Vanderhorst, Isabella Fairfax, Henrietta Hawthorne, and Lucinda Belmonte, had grown up together in a rarefied world of absolute privilege. They attended the same finishing schools in Charleston and Savannah, read the same European philosophy texts, and shared the same sense of intellectual superiority over everyone they considered beneath their station. By 1847, they ranged in age from 28 to 45, all married to men frequently absent on business ventures that took them to New Orleans, Memphis, Mobile, or even as far as New York and London. Charlotte Vandenberg, the eldest at 45, was widely regarded as the most intelligent woman in the district. She spoke fluent French and German, corresponded regularly with European intellectuals, and had amassed a personal library of over 3,000 volumes. Her husband, Willem, spent months at a time managing shipping operations in New Orleans, leaving Charlotte with unprecedented autonomy over Elmwood's 800 enslaved people and 15,000 acres of prime cotton land. Eleanor Dabney, 38, possessed what admirers called a scientific mind. She had studied anatomy and physiology through correspondence with physicians at Charleston Medical College and maintained detailed records of everything from weather patterns to crop yields to what she termed human behavioral observations. Her husband Robert's frequent business trips to northern textile centers gave Eleanor extensive freedom to pursue her increasingly dark interests. The younger women brought their own particular obsessions to the group. Victoria Pembroke, 32, had developed theories about racial hierarchy based on her reading of European anthropological texts. Constance van der Hoog, 29, was fascinated by what she called social engineering, the idea that human behavior could be modified through systematic application of pressure and reward. Isabella Fairfax, Henrietta Hawthorne, and Lucinda Belmont, ranging from 28 to 35, completed the circle with their own specialized interests in human psychology and control. What distinguished these women from other plantation mistresses was not just their wealth and education, but their collective belief that their superior breeding and intellect gave them the right to conduct what they termed behavioral experiments on those they considered their property. They had convinced themselves that their actions served a greater scientific purpose, advancing human knowledge about racial characteristics and social control methods. The enslaved population in the district exceeded 3,000 people, with adult males comprising nearly 40%. These men worked the cotton fields under conditions that killed many within their first years of bondage, managed livestock in swamplands infested with disease-carrying insects, operated dangerous mills and gin houses where limbs were frequently lost to machinery, and maintained the grand estates that generated millions in annual revenue. They lived in quarters that provided basic shelter, but no protection from their owners' increasingly inventive cruelties. Most enslaved men had families, wives, children, elderly parents, creating emotional bonds that the plantation mistresses would learn to exploit with devastating effectiveness. The women had discovered that psychological torture inflicted on family members could break even the strongest individual far more efficiently than direct physical punishment. They began systematically studying these relationships, mapping family connections across all 7 plantations, and identifying which bonds could be most effectively weaponized. Inspector William Hartwell arrived in Natchez on September 20, 1847. Carrying credentials from the Federal Treasury Department and a mandate to investigate irregularities in plantation mortality reports that had attracted attention in Washington. At 34, Hartwell was a meticulous investigator from Portland, Maine, who had previously uncovered corruption in northern textile mills and fraud in federal land office operations. He was methodical, incorruptible, and completely unprepared for the sophisticated evil he would encounter in the Natchez district. Hartwell had been selected for the assignment specifically because he had no connections to Southern society and no financial interests that might compromise his objectivity. His superiors in Washington had grown concerned about mortality rates among enslaved populations in certain districts, not from humanitarian concerns, but because such losses represented significant economic waste that could affect cotton production and federal tax revenues. They wanted a thorough investigation conducted by someone immune to Southern influence. Hartwell's investigation began with what seemed like routine bureaucratic work at Elmwood Plantation, where Charlotte Vandenberg received him in her opulent parlor with the practice charm that had made her famous throughout Mississippi society. The room itself was a testament to wealth beyond most people's comprehension. French wallpaper that cost more than most families earned in a decade, crystal chandelier imported from Venice, Persian carpets that had traveled halfway around the world, and oil paintings by European masters whose names appeared in art history books. Yet, as Hartwell spread the plantation's mortality records across Charlotte's mahogany dining table, disturbing patterns emerged that no amount of Southern hospitality could explain. In the past 18 months, 15 enslaved men between ages 20 and 35 had died from what the meticulously kept records labeled sudden illness, accident during field work, injury from fall, heart failure, or attempted escape. The death rate among this specific demographic was nearly triple the district average and exceeded even the notorious mortality rates of Caribbean sugar plantations. What made the pattern even more suspicious was the timing. The deaths occurred in clusters with multiple fatalities recorded within days of each other, followed by periods of several weeks with normal mortality rates. When Hartwell cross-referenced these dates with shipping records, he discovered they coincided with the arrivals and departures of steamboats that regularly traveled between the 7 plantation landings, suggesting some form of coordinated activity. When Hartwell requested to examine the bodies or interview witnesses to these deaths, Charlotte's demeanor shifted with subtle but unmistakable menace. Her smile never wavered, but her voice acquired an edge that would have chilled a more experienced observer of Southern society. "Inspector," she said, adjusting her silk gloves with deliberate precision, "surely a gentleman of your obvious refinement understands that certain matters of plantation discipline require discretion. These unfortunate souls died because they could not adapt to the civilized order we provide here. Their primitive natures simply could not withstand the demands of productive labor. Perhaps your valuable time would be better spent examining our excellent cotton yields and the substantial tax revenues we generate for the federal government. But Hartwell possessed the stubborn persistence that made him an effective investigator, and Charlotte's obvious evasiveness only strengthened his determination. When he insisted on touring the slave quarters, Charlotte's resistance became more explicit. She claimed that several buildings were under repair following storm damage, that others housed sick slaves who might contaminate a visitor, and that the remaining quarters would tell him nothing useful about the deceased men who had lived there. Finally, under threat of federal subpoena, Charlotte reluctantly agreed to accompany him on a limited inspection of the plantation facilities. What Hartwell found in the slave quarters defied explanation and challenged everything he thought he knew about plantation operations. Multiple buildings showed signs of recent construction and modification, reinforced doors with heavy exterior locks that could only be operated from outside, windows fitted with iron bars that blocked both escape and calls for help, and walls lined with what appeared to be soundproofing made from layers of Spanish moss, clay, and thick timber. When Hartwell questioned the purpose of these modifications, Charlotte claimed they were punishment quarters for incorrigible slaves who require special handling. She explained that some enslaved people were naturally violent and required secure containment to protect other workers and ensure plantation safety. Her explanation might have been plausible if not for the sophisticated nature of the modifications and the obvious expense involved in their construction. The enslaved people themselves presented an even more disturbing puzzle. Men who should have been in their physical prime moved with obvious discomfort and pain, their eyes darting nervously whenever Charlotte appeared. They avoided all eye contact with both Charlotte and Hartwell, responding to questions with barely audible whispers and obvious terror. Several bore visible scars that seemed inconsistent with normal plantation work, precise marks that suggested deliberate infliction rather than accidental injury. Most unsettling was their psychological condition. These were men who should have possessed the natural pride and defiance that plantation owners constantly struggled to suppress. Instead, they displayed the broken demeanor of individuals who had experienced horrors that destroyed their fundamental sense of self. They moved like shadows, spoke like whipped dogs, and seemed to have lost something essential that made them fully human. An elderly enslaved woman named Celia, when she thought Charlotte was out of earshot, whispered to Hartwell with urgent desperation, "They takes the young strong ones to the other houses. Inspector, sir, they goes walking upright like men, but they comes back. They comes back different changed, like something inside them got broke and can't never be fixed no more." Before Hartwell could ask for clarification, Charlotte appeared beside them with the silent menace of a predator. "Celia," she said in a voice like poisoned honey, "I believe you have work to attend to in the kitchen." Inspector Hartwell surely doesn't need to hear the confused ramblings of an old woman whose mind isn't what it used to be. The terror that crossed Celia's face as she hurried away convinced Hartwell that he had stumbled onto something far more sinister than routine plantation discipline. The old woman had been trying to warn him about something, and Charlotte's intervention suggested that such warnings were both dangerous and necessary. That evening, dining alone at the Natchez Inn while reviewing his notes, Hartwell received an unexpected visitor who would provide the first key to understanding the conspiracy he was investigating. A well-dressed, free black man named Samuel Fletcher, who worked as a skilled carpenter throughout the district, approached his table with the nervous intensity of someone risking his life to deliver crucial information. Samuel Fletcher was a remarkable individual, a free man of color who had earned his liberty through skilled craftsmanship and careful navigation of Southern racial hierarchies. At 42, he had built furniture and architectural elements for some of the finest homes in Mississippi, Louisiana, and Alabama. His reputation for discretion and quality workmanship had earned him access to places and conversations that would have been impossible for most people of his race. "Inspector," Fletcher said quietly, glancing around the nearly empty dining room, "there are things you need to know about these plantations, things that happen when decent folks are sleeping and the devil's work can be done in darkness." Over the next hour, Fletcher revealed information that transformed Hartwell's investigation from a routine mortality inquiry into something approaching a criminal investigation. He explained that he had been contracted to build special rooms and furniture in several plantation houses over the past 3 years, facilities with specifications so unusual that they had troubled his conscience from the beginning. They wanted chambers that no sound could escape from, Fletcher explained, his voice barely above a whisper. Stone floors with drainage systems like you'd find in a butcher shop, walls lined with leather padding thick enough to muffle any noise, and furniture I couldn't rightly understand the purpose of. tables with restraints, chairs with mechanisms for holding a man-emo, devices that looked like something from a medieval torture chamber. The construction projects had required Fletcher to work closely with overseers and house slaves who had witnessed things they were forbidden to discuss. Through careful questioning and observation, he had pieced together a picture of activities that defied belief. The plantation mistresses were not simply punishing disobedient slaves. They were conducting systematic experiments in human degradation. When I asked questions about the purpose of these rooms, Fletcher continued, they told me it was for medical treatments of difficult slaves, said they were working with doctors from New Orleans to develop new methods for treating mental disorders and violent tendencies. But, Inspector, I've seen enough violence in my life to know the difference between healing and hurting. More disturbing were Fletcher's accounts of what he had witnessed while working late at these properties. I've seen them move groups of men between plantations in the dead of night, he said, his hands trembling slightly. Always the young, strong ones, men with families, men with spirit, men who might cause trouble if they weren't broken properly. They go from one plantation walking upright with fire in their eyes, but when they come back weeks or months later, he shuddered and struggled to continue. They come back as ghosts of themselves, broken inside where it don't show on the outside. They won't look you in the eye, won't speak unless spoken to, move like they're afraid their own shadow might hurt them. Whatever happens in those special rooms, Inspector, it destroys something in a man that can't never be rebuilt. Fletcher also revealed the existence of what he called the monthly meetings, elaborate social gatherings that the 7 plantation mistresses hosted in rotation. During these events, he had observed activities that suggested the women were sharing more than just dinner and conversation. I was working late on a cabinet repair at Riverside Estate when one of these meetings was happening, Fletcher recalled. Through the windows, I could see them ladies all dressed up in their finest gowns. But in the plantation yard behind the house, there were torches burning in strange patterns, groups of enslaved men being moved between different areas and sounds. He paused, struggling to find words. Sounds that weren't quite screams, but weren't nothing natural either, as Fletcher prepared to leave, risking discovery by remaining too long in public conversation with a federal investigator. He pressed a small leather journal into Hartwell's hands. This belonged to a slave named Marcus Washington, who died at Riverside Estate last month. He said he could read and write, learned it secret-like from a house slave who'd been taught by her mistress's children. Marcus kept this journal hidden in his cabin, writing down what was happening to him and the other men. His wife Sarah gave it to me before she was sold away after his death. She said somebody needed to know the truth about what killed her husband. That night, by candlelight in his hotel room, Hartwell opened Marcus Washington's journal and began to understand the true scope of the conspiracy he was investigating. The entries, written in a careful, educated hand, detailed experiences that challenged human comprehension and revealed the systematic nature of the cruelties being inflicted. Marcus described being borrowed by different plantation mistresses, each of whom had developed specific methods of physical and psychological torture disguised as discipline and correction. He wrote of being forced to watch other men suffer, of being subjected to medical experiments that served no healing purpose, and of a deliberate, systematic effort to destroy the minds and spirits of enslaved men through increasingly creative applications of pain, fear, and despair. One entry, dated just 2 weeks before Marcus's death, proved particularly chilling. Miss Alelena brought me back to watch what she called her loyalty experiment on Samuel Robinson. She got Samuel's wife Mary and their little boy Thomas tied up where Samuel can see them from where he chained to that special table she had built. Then she started hurting Mary while asking Samuel questions about whether he loved his family more than he feared his mistress. Every time Samuel say he loved his family, she hurt Mary worse. Every time he say he fear his mistress more, she hurt the boy. Samuel, a strong man, Inspector, sir, strongest man on the plantation before this happened. But after 3 hours of watching his wife and son suffer for his answers, Samuel just broke completely. Started saying he don't love nobody, don't care about nobody, just want the hurting to stop. Miss Elena wrote it all down in her book, timing everything with her pocket watch, measuring it like we was animals in some terrible experiment. The journal contained dozens of similar entries, each documenting specific techniques used to break human spirits through the systematic exploitation of love, hope, faith, and every other emotion that made life worth living. Hartwell's investigation deepened over the following weeks, revealing a conspiracy that had been developing for nearly a decade with the methodical precision of a scientific endeavor. Through careful examination of shipping records, bank transactions, personal correspondence, and testimony from free blacks like Fletcher, he began to piece together the origins and evolution of what the women privately called their correctional circle. The arrangement had begun with deceptive innocence in 1839 when Charlotte Vandenberg and Eloinor Dabney discovered they shared similar frustrations about managing large enslaved populations. Both women had been educated at Charleston's exclusive Madame Talvandi's School for Young Ladies, where they had studied the latest European theories on human behavior, social control, and what contemporary intellectuals called the science of racial management. They began corresponding regularly about their experiences, initially sharing conventional wisdom about maintaining plantation discipline. The early correspondence, which Hartwell later obtained through federal seizure orders, revealed an escalating fascination with the psychological aspects of control that quickly moved beyond standard plantation management. Letters from 1840 discussed traditional disciplinary measures, reduced food rations, extra work assignments, temporary confinement in punishment cells, public whippings designed to deter other slaves from similar infractions. But by 1841, their exchanges had taken a distinctly darker turn that revealed the intellectual arrogance underlying their cruelty. Charlotte wrote in a letter dated March 15, 1841, "My dear Eleanor, I find myself increasingly frustrated by the limitations of traditional punishment methods. These creatures seem to adapt to physical discomfort with disturbing resilience, and the effects of standard discipline fade within weeks. I believe we are approaching this problem from an insufficiently sophisticated perspective. These are not merely bodies that require correction, but minds that must be properly shaped. Perhaps we should focus not on their behavior, but on the fundamental thoughts and feelings that drive such behavior." Eleanor's response, dated April 3, 1841, introduced the concept that would become the foundation of their conspiracy. "Charlotte, your insights align perfectly with my own observations. I have been reading the latest European works on human psychology and social engineering, and I believe we have been thinking too narrowly about our responsibilities as plantation mistresses. We possess unique opportunities to advance human knowledge while solving our practical problems. Perhaps we might benefit from sharing our most difficult cases between plantations, temporary transfers that would allow each of us to apply different methods to the same subjects. What fails under one approach might succeed brilliantly under another." This concept of experimental exchanges attracted other plantation mistresses gradually, as Charlotte and Eleanor shared their developing theories through the extensive social networks that connected wealthy Southern families. Victoria Pembroke joined the conspiracy in late 1841 after her husband's prolonged absence on business left her struggling with what she perceived as increasing insubordination among her male slaves. Her correspondence revealed a woman desperately seeking to prove her intellectual equality with men by mastering what she considered the ultimate challenge, the complete domination of other human beings. Constance Vanderhorst became involved through her close friendship with Victoria, drawn by what she described in letters as the intellectual challenge of understanding the Negro mind and the scientific possibilities of behavioral modification. And she had read extensively in European medical literature about mental illness, and believed that the same techniques used to treat madness might be applied to what she considered the inherent rebelliousness of enslaved people. Isabella Fairfax, Henrietta Hawthorne, and Lucinda Belmont completed the circle by 1843, each bringing her own particular obsessions and methods to the arrangement. Isabella was fascinated by what she called loyalty engineering, techniques for destroying existing emotional bonds and replacing them with absolute devotion to masters. Henrietta focused on what she termed identity reconstruction, believing she could systematically erase individual personalities and rebuild them according to her specifications. Lucinda specialized in physical torture methods, but approached them with scientific precision rather than random cruelty. By 1844, the women had established elaborate protocols for their exchanges that revealed the systematic nature of their conspiracy. Enslaved men would be loaned between plantations for periods ranging from 1 week to 6 months, during which time the receiving mistress had complete authority over the individual's treatment, condition, and ultimate fate. Detailed records were kept of each man's psychological profile, physical characteristics, family relationships, religious beliefs, and personal history before treatment began. During the exchange period, the women documented every aspect of their subjects' responses to various forms of physical and psychological pressure. They developed sophisticated classification systems, categorizing enslaved men by personality type, intelligence level, physical resilience, and what they called correction potential. They maintained detailed charts tracking which methods produced the most lasting changes in behavior and which combinations of techniques achieved the most complete psychological destruction. Most sinister was their systematic exploitation of family relationships as tools for psychological torture. The women had discovered that traditional physical punishment often strengthened enslaved people's resolve by giving them something concrete to endure and overcome. But the threat of harm to loved ones created a different kind of suffering, one that attacked the victim's fundamental sense of identity and purpose. They began mapping family connections across all 7 plantations with genealogical precision, identifying fathers, husbands, sons, brothers, and friends whose welfare could be used as leverage against targeted individuals. They developed techniques for convincing men that their resistance would result in their families being sold to brutal plantations in the Deep South, or worse, that their loved ones were already suffering torture because of their defiance. The psychological manipulation became increasingly sophisticated as the women learned from experience and shared successful techniques. They would separate families temporarily, then reunite them under conditions designed to maximize emotional manipulation. A man might be told his wife was dead, allowed to grieve for weeks, then suddenly presented with evidence that she was alive, but suffering because of his behavior. By 1845, the women had constructed the specialized facilities that Fletcher had described, chambers specifically designed for human experimentation, disguised as punishment. Each plantation now contained what they euphemistically called correction facilities, soundproofed rooms equipped with restraints, specialized furniture, observation areas, and detailed record-keeping stations where the mistresses could monitor and document their subjects' responses to various treatments. The most disturbing aspect of Hartwell's discoveries was the meticulous documentation the women maintained. They kept detailed journals of each session complete with anatomical sketches, precise measurements, clinical observations, and theoretical analysis. These records revealed a systematic effort to understand the exact conditions under which human dignity could be destroyed and rebuilt according to their specifications. They recorded precise timing for psychological breakdowns, measured physical responses to different types of pain, documented which threats were most effective against different personality types, and maintained detailed charts showing the correlation between various treatment methods and long-term behavioral changes. They approached the destruction of human beings with the same methodical precision that others might apply to breeding livestock or developing new agricultural techniques. Dr. Doe Edmund Carey, a physician from New Orleans who had been called to treat medical emergencies at several district plantations, provided Hartwell with additional context that confirmed the systematic nature of the conspiracy. Speaking confidentially in his office overlooking the French Quarter, Dr. Copper Carey described being called to examine slaves who had suffered what the mistresses described as disciplinary accidents or complications from medical treatment. Inspector, Dr. Have, Carey said, his hands trembling slightly as he poured himself a glass of bourbon. In 23 years of practicing medicine throughout Louisiana and Mississippi, I have never encountered anything approaching the systematic cruelty these women have devised. The injuries I observed were not the result of anger or loss of control. They showed evidence of careful planning, precise execution, and scientific observation. The doctor revealed that several of the women had requested detailed consultations about human anatomy, pain tolerance, psychological disorders, and recovery times from various types of trauma. They claimed to be developing better methods for treating mental illness and violent tendencies among their enslaved population. But the questions they asked revealed interests that had nothing to do with healing. They wanted to know exactly how much physical damage a human body could sustain without permanent disability. Dr. 2, Carey explained, they asked about techniques for inflicting maximum pain without causing visible injury, methods for inducing temporary paralysis or blindness, and drugs that could affect memory or personality. When I expressed concern about the purpose of such inquiries, they assured me they were working with other physicians to develop more humane approaches to plantation discipline. The women had also commissioned detailed anatomical drawings, medical texts about mental disorders, and even corresponded with physicians in Europe about the latest theories on human psychology and behavioral modification. They were building a comprehensive library of information about human vulnerability, all disguised as legitimate medical and scientific inquiry. Perhaps most disturbing was Dr. Kay's revelation that he had been asked to certify deaths that he suspected were actually murders. On at least 6 occasions, he said, I was called to examine slaves who had allegedly died from natural causes, heart failure, stroke, sudden illness, but whose bodies showed subtle signs of deliberate harm. When I questioned these diagnoses, I was told that plantation discipline sometimes produced unexpected complications and that my role was to provide official documentation, not to conduct criminal investigations. The doctor's testimony revealed that the conspiracy extended beyond the 7 core families to include local officials, physicians, overseers, and other professionals who were either complicit in the crimes or intimidated into silence. The women had created a network of corruption that protected their activities and ensured that evidence of their crimes would be suppressed or destroyed. As October progressed, Hartwell's investigation uncovered increasingly disturbing evidence of the correctional circle's activities and their systematic approach to what they considered advanced human management. His breakthrough came when he gained access to the personal library at Magnolia Grove, where Victoria Pembroke had assembled what may have been the most comprehensive collection of books on human psychology, medical experimentation, and behavioral modification in the entire South. The library itself was impressive. Over 800 volumes housed in custom-built walnut cases that reached from floor to ceiling. But the content was what made Hartwell's blood run cold. Victoria had systematically acquired works on human anatomy, psychological disorders, torture techniques from various historical periods, military interrogation methods, and the latest European theories on racial characteristics and social control. She had corresponded with authors, physicians, and researchers throughout Europe and America, building a network of contacts who shared her interests in human experimentation. Among these volumes, carefully hidden behind false backs on several shelves, Hartwell discovered detailed journals dating back to 1841 that documented the true scope of the women's activities. These journals, written in Victoria's precise handwriting with the clinical detachment of a scientist, revealed their systematic approach to what they termed advanced plantation management and human behavioral modification. The journals contained detailed case studies of individual enslaved men, complete with before and after psychological assessments, physical examinations, family relationship maps, and step-by-step documentation of the techniques used to achieve what Victoria called complete personality reconstruction. Each case was numbered and cross-referenced with similar entries in the other women's records, creating a comprehensive database of human experimentation. Case study number 23, dated March 15, 1844, provided chilling insight into their methodology. Subject: Thomas Jennings, age 26, acquired from Elmwood Plantation. Initial assessment reveals typical patterns of covert resistance. Maintains direct eye contact with authority figures. Subtle defiance in posture and movement. Attempts to comfort fellow subjects during preliminary observation period. Strong family attachments identified. Wife Sarah, age 24. Children Marcus, age 6, and Elizabeth, age 4. Elderly mother Ruth, age approximately 60. Religious faith appears central to subjects' psychological stability. The entry continued with detailed documentation of a 14-day treatment protocol that systematically destroyed every aspect of Thomas's psychological foundation. Day 1 to 3. Complete isolation in soundproof chamber, minimal food and water, constant exposure to recorded distress calls allegedly from family members. Subject: maintains defiant posture. Day 47. Introduction of physical discomfort through temperature manipulation, sleep deprivation, and sensory overload. Subject begins showing signs of psychological stress, but maintains core resistance. Day 8, 11. Direct threats to family members combined with fabricated evidence of their suffering. Subject's defiance begins to crack. Day 12 to 14. Presentation of false evidence that family has been sold to brutal sugar plantation due to subject's resistance. Complete psychological collapse achieved. The final assessment was written with the same clinical detachment used to describe a successful medical procedure. Subject now demonstrates complete submission to authority. All patterns of resistance eliminated. Emotional attachment to family successfully severed. Religious faith destroyed through systematic blasphemy exposure. Physical capabilities remain intact. Psychological reconstruction phase can now begin. Subject ready for return to standard plantation duties with enhanced compliance protocols. The journals reveal that the women had developed increasingly sophisticated techniques over the years, learning from each case and refining their methods for maximum effectiveness. They had discovered that different personality types required different approaches. Proud men needed to be humiliated. Religious men needed their faith destroyed. Family-oriented men needed to believe their loved ones were suffering because of their resistance. They had also developed techniques for what they called identity reconstruction, systematically destroying an individual's sense of self and rebuilding them according to desired specifications. The process involved complete isolation for extended periods, constant psychological pressure, deliberate confusion about reality and fantasy, and gradual reintroduction of human contact only in exchange for absolute obedience and the adoption of new identities. Men who had once been fathers, husbands, community leaders, and skilled craftsmen would emerge from these treatments, believing themselves to be nothing more than tools for their owner's use. They would have no memory of their previous lives, no emotional connections to other people, and no desires beyond serving their master's wishes. The transformation was so complete that even family members often failed to recognize them. Hartwell's investigation also revealed the economic dimensions of the correctional circle's activities. The women had discovered that their processed slaves commanded significantly higher prices when sold, as they were perceived throughout the South as exceptionally obedient and unlikely to cause problems for new owners. Word of the Natchez method had spread through underground networks of slave traders, plantation owners, and overseers, creating a lucrative market for their services. Financial records hidden in Victoria's library showed that the 7 families had generated additional revenue of nearly $50,000 annually through these sales, an enormous sum that exceeded the annual income of most northern businesses. They had established connections with slave traders throughout the South, marketing their services as providers of premium disciplined labor for the most demanding situations. Some clients paid additional fees to specify particular types of correction for slaves they intended to purchase. A New Orleans sugar plantation owner had paid extra to ensure that his new workers would have no memory of freedom or family relationships that might inspire escape attempts. A Mississippi River steamboat company had requested slaves who would be completely immune to the influence of free black workers they might encounter in northern ports. Perhaps most shocking was Hartwell's discovery that the women had begun experimenting on free blacks as well, using legal challenges to their freedom status as pretext for forcing them into their system. Samuel Fletcher, the carpenter who had initially approached Hartwell, had narrowly escaped becoming a victim himself when the women had questioned his documentation and attempted to have him declared a fugitive slave subject to capture and correction. Fletcher revealed that at least 5 other free blacks had disappeared from the Natchez area over the past 2 years, all after refusing to comply with demands from plantation mistresses or challenging their authority in business dealings. Local authorities had dismissed these disappearances as routine departures for better opportunities elsewhere, but Fletcher suspected the missing individuals had been forced into the correctional circle system and then sold as slaves to distant buyers who would ask no questions about their origins. The scope of the conspiracy expanded even further when Hartwell discovered correspondence between the Natchez women and similar groups operating in other southern states. Letters from plantation mistresses in Georgia, South Carolina, Alabama, and even Virginia suggested that the Natchez method was being studied and adopted throughout the region. The women had begun hosting what they called educational seminars, teaching other slaveholders their techniques for advanced behavioral modification. A letter from Margaret Fitzgerald of Savannah, Georgia, dated August 12, 1847, revealed the extent of their influence. Dear Charlotte, I cannot adequately express my gratitude for the instruction you provided during my recent visit to Natchez. The techniques you demonstrated have proven remarkably effective with our most difficult cases. We have successfully processed 12 subjects using your methods, with complete success in 11 cases. I am particularly impressed with your innovation of using family separation as a primary tool rather than merely a threat. We are now planning to expand our facilities and would welcome additional consultation on the proper construction of soundproof chambers and specialized furniture. The women were not merely operating a local conspiracy. They were developing and disseminating techniques for systematic human destruction throughout the slaveholding South. They saw themselves as pioneers in a new science of social control, and they were actively working to ensure that their methods would survive and spread long after their own deaths. Most disturbing of all was evidence suggesting that prominent Southern intellectuals and politicians were aware of and supportive of their activities. Letters from university professors, medical school faculty, and government officials praised the women's contributions to the advancement of knowledge about racial characteristics and proper social order. Some correspondents suggested that their methods might be applicable to controlling other inferior populations beyond enslaved blacks, including poor whites, immigrants, and Native Americans. The correctional circle represented more than isolated criminal activity by wealthy plantation owners. It was part of a broader effort to develop scientific methods for maintaining social hierarchies through the systematic destruction of human dignity and identity. The women of Natchez were not acting alone. They were part of a growing network of Southern intellectuals who believed that their superior breeding and education gave them the right to experiment on those they considered racially and socially inferior. By mid-October, Hartwell realized that his investigation had not gone unnoticed by the 7 plantation mistresses, and they were taking increasingly aggressive steps to protect their conspiracy from exposure. The signs of surveillance began subtly. Hotel staff who had previously been helpful became evasive and unhelpful. Local officials who had initially cooperated with his request suddenly claimed to be too busy to assist federal investigations, and several potential witnesses who had agreed to meet with him simply disappeared without explanation. The escalation became unmistakable on October 10th, when Hartwell returned to his hotel room to find that his belongings had been carefully searched during his absence. Nothing was missing, but his papers had been examined and reorganized in ways that made it clear someone had spent considerable time reviewing his documentation. More ominously, a note had been left on his pillow, written in elegant feminine handwriting. Inspector, some mysteries are better left unsolved. Consider your health and that of your family in Maine. The threat was delivered with the refined politeness that characterized Southern aristocratic society, but its meaning was unmistakable. The women knew about his wife Martha and their 2 young children in Portland. They had the resources and connections to reach beyond Mississippi if necessary to protect their interests. Hartwell realized that his investigation had evolved from a bureaucratic inquiry into a deadly game where the stakes included not only his own life, but the safety of everyone he loved. The tension escalated dramatically on October 12th, when Hartwell attempted to conduct an unannounced inspection of the specialized facilities at Cedar Hill Plantation. He had hoped to catch the Vanderhoosts unprepared and perhaps observe evidence that could not be hidden or explained away. Instead, he found that Constance Vanderhorst was expecting him, accompanied by her overseer, 2 armed guards, and a man who introduced himself as her husband, recently returned from New Orleans. Inspector Hartwell, Constance said with cold formality that contrasted sharply with the warm hospitality he had received during his initial visits. I'm afraid there has been a serious misunderstanding about the scope of your authority here. My husband would like to discuss certain legal questions about federal jurisdiction over private property and internal plantation affairs. But Hartwell knew that Constance's husband remained in New Orleans conducting steamboat business. He had confirmed this through telegraph communications with shipping companies that very morning. The man standing beside her was either an imposter or someone playing a role in an elaborate deception. The realization revealed that the women were now actively coordinating their response to his investigation with sophisticated precision. When Hartwell pressed to examine the slave quarters and the special buildings that Fletcher had described, Constance refused outright, claiming that several slaves were suffering from a highly contagious illness that made inspection dangerous for visitors. She produced what appeared to be a medical certificate from a New Orleans physician confirming the outbreak and recommending quarantine procedures. The document was expertly forged, but small details revealed its fraudulent nature to Hartwell's trained investigator's eye. The paper was too new, the ink too fresh, and the physician's signature suspiciously similar to handwriting samples he had seen in correspondence from the plantation mistresses. They were not merely hiding evidence. They were actively manufacturing false documentation to obstruct his investigation. As Hartwell prepared to leave Cedar Hill, the man posing as Constance's husband approached him with an offer that revealed the true nature of the situation. "Inspector," he said in a voice that carried the authority of significant wealth and political connections, "perhaps we can resolve this matter efficiently. I understand that federal investigators are often undercompensated for their valuable work. A man of your obvious intelligence and discretion might find that certain consulting opportunities could prove quite lucrative." The bribe was offered with the confidence of people who had successfully corrupted federal officials before. When Hartwell firmly declined, the man's demeanor shifted to open hostility. "Very well, Inspector, but understand that your continued interference with private property rights and legitimate business operations will not be tolerated indefinitely. This region has ways of dealing with outside agitators who exceed their authority." That evening, Hartwell received a dinner invitation from Charlotte Vandenberg, ostensibly to discuss his findings in a social setting and perhaps reap some accommodation that would satisfy federal requirements while respecting local customs. Against his better judgment, but hoping to gather additional evidence and perhaps identify other participants in the conspiracy, he accepted the invitation to dine at Elmwood Plantation. The dinner proved to be an elaborate psychological warfare operation designed to assess Hartwell's knowledge, determine his vulnerabilities, and deliver threats with the sophisticated cruelty that characterized everything the women did. All 7 mistresses were present along with their overseers. several local officials whom Hartwell recognized as being financially dependent on the plantation families, and a handful of men who introduced themselves as visiting businessmen, but who carried themselves with the disciplined alertness of professional enforcers. The conversation began with seemingly innocent discussions of northern politics, economic conditions, and social developments. But Hartwell quickly realized that the women were probing for information about his background, family situation, political connections, and personal weaknesses. They asked detailed questions about his wife's health, his children's education, his financial circumstances, and his career ambitions with the pretense of polite social interest. Inspector Hartwell Elenina Dabney said as the main course was served, "We understand you have been asking questions about our plantation management methods. Perhaps you don't fully appreciate the complexities of maintaining order among such large populations of primitive people. The methods we employ may seem harsh to northern sensibilities, but they are necessary for maintaining the peace and prosperity that benefits everyone in our region." Victoria Pembroke added with a smile that never reached her eyes, "We have invested considerable time and resources in developing techniques that are both effective and, in their own way, humane. Surely you understand that some situations require specialized approaches that might not be appropriate for discussion in polite society." The most chilling moment came when Isabella Fairfax leaned forward and spoke quietly. "We have heard that several federal investigators have visited our region over the years. Inspector Most found that their initial concerns were unfounded. They typically concluded their work quickly and returned north with reports that praised our efficient operations and substantial contributions to national prosperity." Henrietta Hawthorne completed the threat by observing with apparent casualness, "The Mississippi River has always been dangerous for travelers unfamiliar with local conditions. Steamboat accidents, robberies by river pirates, mysterious illnesses contracted in our humid climate. So many unfortunate incidents have befallen visitors to our region over the years." Lucinda Belmonte delivered the final warning with the practiced cruelty that made her particularly effective in the correctional circle's operations. "We sincerely hope, Inspector, that you will complete your investigation expeditiously and file a report that reflects the true nature of our operations. We would hate for you to experience the same misfortunes that have befallen other federal employees who misunderstood their role here." As the evening concluded, Charlotte Vandenberg made one final statement that left no doubt about the women's intentions and capabilities. "Inspector Hartwell, we represent families that have shaped the economic and political development of this region for generations. Our influence extends far beyond Mississippi. We have connections in Washington, New York, London, and Paris. We control banks, shipping companies, newspapers, and political organizations throughout the South. You would be wise to remember that your authority here exists only at our sufferance, and that sufferance has limits." Hartwell left the dinner knowing that his life was in immediate danger, but he also realized that the women had inadvertently revealed crucial information about the scope of their conspiracy and their methods of maintaining control. Their coordinated response confirmed that they were operating as an organized criminal enterprise with resources and connections that reached far beyond local plantation management. The next morning brought even more disturbing developments that transformed the investigation into a desperate race against time. Samuel Fletcher failed to appear for a scheduled meeting at a predetermined location, and inquiries at his residence revealed that he had disappeared during the night under circumstances that suggested kidnapping rather than voluntary departure. Fletcher's wife, Mary, was in a state of near-complete terror when Hartwell spoke with her. She described armed men who had surrounded their house at midnight, demanded to know what information Samuel had shared with the federal inspector, and then taken him away despite his protests that he was a free man with proper documentation. The men had warned Mary that any attempt to contact authorities would result in her husband's immediate death and her own enslavement. "They told me Samuel was going to learn what happens to people who forget their place," Mary said through tears. "They said he was going to be taught proper respect for white ladies, and that when they finished with him, he wouldn't be causing no more trouble for anybody." The kidnapping of Fletcher revealed that the conspiracy extended beyond the 7 core plantation families to include local law enforcement, judges, and other officials who were either participants in the crimes or too intimidated to oppose them. When Hartwell attempted to file official reports about Fletcher's disappearance, he was told that free blacks frequently left the area without notice and that no investigation would be conducted without clear evidence of foul play. Hartwell's investigation was now a race against time and his own survival. The women clearly intended to eliminate all evidence of their activities, including witnesses, documentation, and the federal inspector himself. He began making copies of all his evidence and arranging to have them transmitted north through various channels, hoping that at least some documentation would survive, even if he did not. The final escalation came on October 13th when Hartwell discovered that his telegraph communications were being intercepted and his movements were being monitored by a network of informants throughout Natchez. His hotel room was under constant surveillance. His meals were being prepared by people loyal to the plantation families, and even his conversations with other guests were being reported to the conspiracy's leadership. Most ominously, he began receiving detailed information about his family's daily activities in Portland, descriptions of his wife's shopping trips, his children's school schedules, and the routine of their household that could only have come from direct observation. The women were not merely threatening him. They were demonstrating their ability to reach his family, regardless of the distance involved. That evening, alone in his hotel room and surrounded by evidence of crimes that challenged human comprehension, Hartwell faced the most difficult decision of his career. He could attempt to rescue Fletcher and the other victims he had identified, almost certainly resulting in his own death and the destruction of all evidence he had gathered, or he could focus on preserving the documentation and escaping with proof that might eventually bring justice, even if it meant abandoning immediate victims to their fate. The choice would determine not only his own survival, but the fate of thousands of enslaved people throughout the region who were suffering under the correctional circle's systematic cruelties. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in the Natchez district intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next. The confrontation that would expose the full horror of the correctional circle began on the night of October 14th when Hartwell made the desperate decision to conduct a covert inspection of Riverside Estate during one of the women's monthly gatherings. Using detailed information that Fletcher had provided before his disappearance, combined with reconnaissance he had conducted over several days, Hartwell approached Elelonena Dabney's plantation from the riverside under cover of darkness, avoiding the main roads where guards and informants might detect his presence. The Mississippi River at night was a nightmare landscape of treacherous currents, hidden snags, and impenetrable darkness broken only by occasional torches from passing steamboats. Hartwell made his way along the muddy bank, struggling through thick vegetation and fighting off swarms of insects that seemed to sense his fear and desperation. The sounds of the night, owls calling like lost souls, the splash of unseen creatures in the dark water, the rustle of Spanish moss in trees that looked like hanged men, created an atmosphere of dread that seemed to anticipate the horrors he was about to witness. As he approached the plantation buildings, the scene that emerged from the darkness defied belief and would haunt him for the remainder of his life. The yard behind the main house was illuminated by dozens of torches arranged in precise geometric patterns that cast dancing shadows across what could only be described as a systematic torture operation disguised as a social gathering. The 7 mistresses were present in their finest evening gowns, elaborate silk and satin creations worth more than most people earned in a lifetime, moving between different stations where various forms of physical and psychological torment were being inflicted on 12 enslaved men. The women approached their work with the detached professionalism of scientists conducting experiments, taking detailed notes, discussing their observations with colleagues, and occasionally adjusting their methods based on the responses they observed. Elelonena Dabney, serving as hostess for the evening's activities, was demonstrating what she called graduated pressure techniques using a sophisticated apparatus that allowed precise control over the amount of physical stress applied to a human body. The device, constructed of polished wood and brass fittings that suggested considerable expense and craftsmanship, held a man named Joseph in a position that allowed systematic application of pressure to various parts of his anatomy, while leaving him conscious and able to respond to questions. "Ladies," Elelonena was explaining to her colleagues as she adjusted the mechanism, "the key to effective behavioral modification lies in understanding the precise relationship between physical discomfort and psychological compliance. Too little pressure produces no lasting change, while too much pressure results in unconsciousness or death before useful data can be gathered." The art lies in maintaining the optimal level of stimulus for maximum educational value. As she spoke, she was carefully documenting Joseph's responses in a leather-bound journal, noting the exact amount of pressure applied, the duration of each application, and the subject's verbal and physical reactions. She periodically consulted a pocket watch, timing everything with scientific precision, while Joseph's screams provided a horrific soundtrack to her clinical observations. Victoria Pembroke had established what she termed a loyalty dissolution station, where men were forced to make impossible choices between their own suffering and the welfare of family members. She had arranged a complex scenario where Marcus, a man Hartwell recognized from his previous plantation visits, was required to choose between enduring continued torture himself or watching his wife Sarah and their young son endure similar treatment. The fascinating aspect of this experiment, Victoria was explaining to Constance Vanderhorst, is observing the precise point at which familial bonds can be severed through systematic psychological pressure. Marcus began this session with typical assertions of love for his family and willingness to suffer in their place. But watch how his responses change as we escalate the consequences of his emotional attachments. Sarah and her son were not actually being tortured, but Marcus could not see them clearly through the smoky torchlight and shadows. Victoria was using sounds, shadows, and his own imagination to convince him that his family was suffering because of his resistance to her demands. The psychological manipulation was so sophisticated that Marcus was beginning to beg Victoria to stop hurting his family and allow him to suffer alone. Exactly the response she was seeking to document and replicate. Constance Vanderhoof was conducting what she described as identity dissolution experiments using a combination of sensory deprivation, sleep deprivation, and constant verbal assault designed to break down her subject's psychological defenses completely. Her victim, a man named David, who had been considered one of the most intelligent and articulate enslaved people in the district, was chained in a specially constructed chamber that eliminated all visual stimuli while amplifying disturbing sounds and smells. The goal, Constance was explaining while making notes in her own journal, is to determine the minimum time required to completely destroy an individual's sense of self and personal identity. David has been subjected to this treatment for 6 days now, and we are beginning to see encouraging signs of psychological fragmentation. He no longer responds to his name, shows no recognition of family members, and demonstrates increasing compliance with any command, regardless of how degrading or harmful. Isabella Fairfax was pursuing her specialty in what she called faith destruction methodology, working systematically to destroy the religious beliefs that provided psychological strength to her subjects. She had constructed an elaborate blasphemous ritual designed to force enslaved men to participate in acts that violated their deepest spiritual convictions, documenting how the destruction of religious faith correlated with increased susceptibility to other forms of psychological control. Henrietta Hawthorne was conducting experiments in memory modification using techniques that combined physical trauma with psychological manipulation to create false memories and destroy true ones. Her subject appeared to be in a state of complete confusion, unable to distinguish between real experiences and the fabricated memories she had systematically implanted through weeks of careful work. Lucinda Belmonte, the most sadistic of the group, was demonstrating advanced pain application techniques using instruments that had obviously been designed specifically for torture. Her approach was more directly physical than her colleagues, but no less systematic in its precision and documentation. She was maintaining detailed charts showing the correlation between different types and intensities of pain and the resulting changes in behavior and compliance. What united all these activities was the clinical precision with which the women approached the systematic destruction of human dignity and identity. They were not acting from anger, passion, or loss of control. They were conducting scientific experiments in human degradation, seeking to develop repeatable methods for transforming independent human beings into completely submissive tools. Most disturbing was their obvious enjoyment of the process. The women laughed and chatted as they worked, occasionally complimenting each other on particularly innovative techniques or impressive results. They had created a sophisticated social event around systematic cruelty, transforming torture into entertainment for their exclusive circle while convincing themselves that they were advancing human knowledge. The evening's activities were being documented not only in individual journals, but also through detailed sketches, measurements, and even de jure photographs that would preserve visual records of their techniques for future reference and instruction. They were building a comprehensive manual of human destruction that could be used by future generations throughout the South and beyond. As the night progressed, Hartwell witnessed the arrival of Samuel Fletcher, barely conscious and showing obvious signs of having endured days of torture since his kidnapping. The women greeted his presence with enthusiasm, eager to demonstrate their techniques on someone who had dared to assist the federal investigation. Fletcher's treatment was being conducted with particular cruelty as an example to any other free blacks who might consider cooperating with outside authorities. The evening's culmination came when the women gathered to discuss their results, plan future experiments, and coordinate the expansion of their operations to other regions. Their conversation revealed the true scope of their ambitions and the systematic nature of their conspiracy to develop and disseminate methods for controlling not just enslaved populations, but any group they considered inferior. "We have proven beyond doubt," Elelonina Dabney announced to the assembled group, "that human will can be systematically destroyed and rebuilt according to our specifications. The techniques we have developed represent a revolution in social control that extends far beyond plantation management. We possess the knowledge necessary to reshape entire populations, eliminate resistance to proper authority, and create stable social hierarchies based on natural superiority rather than mere force." Charlotte Vandenberg added with obvious pride, "Our success here demonstrates the intellectual superiority of our race and class. We have applied scientific methods to solve fundamental problems of social organization. This knowledge makes us powerful beyond measure and positions us to lead the development of proper civilization throughout America and beyond." Victoria Pembroke revealed the extent of their future plans. "We have received inquiries from plantation owners throughout the South, military officials interested in controlling captured populations, and even northern industrialists seeking methods for managing immigrant workers. The applications of our techniques are virtually unlimited, and the financial opportunities are extraordinary." As the women prepared to conclude their gathering and return to their roles as respectable plantation mistresses, Hartwell realized they were planning to eliminate all evidence of their activities, including the remaining witnesses who could testify about their crimes. Several of the tortured men showed signs of being deliberately destroyed to prevent them from surviving to tell their stories. Samuel Fletcher was among those marked for elimination, along with several other free blacks who had provided information to the federal investigation. The women were methodically removing anyone who could expose their conspiracy while preparing to expand their operations throughout the region and beyond. Faced with this realization, Hartwell confronted an impossible decision that would determine not only his own fate, but the fate of thousands of current and future victims of the correctional circle's systematic cruelties. Hartwell made the agonizing decision to escape with his evidence, rather than attempt an immediate rescue that would certainly result in his death and the destruction of all proof of the conspiracy's crimes. He spent the remainder of that horrific night copying his most crucial documentation, preparing detailed reports for multiple federal agencies, and arranging for the evidence to be transmitted through various channels to ensure that at least some proof would survive, even if he did not. His final telegram sent from Natchez on October 15th, using a coded system he had developed with his superiors in Washington, contained a message that would eventually bring federal intervention. Systematic brutalities beyond documentation confirmed. 7 families operating organized torture network affecting hundreds of victims. International connections established. Request immediate military intervention. Personal safety compromised. Critical evidence secured and transmitted. The telegram was intercepted by local authorities loyal to the plantation families, but Hartwell's careful preparations ensured that copies had been transmitted through alternative channels, including steamboat captains sympathetic to abolition causes, northern business contacts, and even foreign consuls who were horrified by what they learned of American slavery practices. Hartwell's prions proved crucial when his carriage was attacked on October 17th while traveling the Natchez Trace toward Jackson. The assault was carried out by professional killers hired by the plantation families. Men experienced in making murders appear to be routine robberies that plagued the dangerous wilderness road. Although Hartwell escaped with his life, he was severely wounded and forced to hide in the forests and swamps surrounding the Mississippi River until federal reinforcements could arrive. The rescue operation that followed revealed the full scope of the conspiracy's horrors and the sophisticated network of corruption that had protected it for nearly a decade. Federal troops from New Orleans, accompanied by officers from the Army Corps of Engineers and Treasury investigators, conducted simultaneous raids on all 7 plantations on November 3, 1847. What they discovered in the specialized facilities exceeded even Hartwell's detailed reports and challenged the comprehension of hardened military officers who had witnessed the brutalities of war. The physical evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. The torture chambers contained devices of sophisticated design that revealed both considerable financial investment and detailed knowledge of human anatomy. The leather-bound journals documented thousands of cases of systematic abuse with scientific precision. Financial records proved the sale of tortured individuals and the profits generated from their suffering. Correspondence revealed plans to establish similar operations throughout the South and even extend the techniques to other populations. Most damning were the victims themselves, dozens of enslaved men bearing physical and psychological scars that provided living testimony to the conspiracy's crimes. Many were so severely damaged that they could no longer function as independent human beings. Several had lost the ability to speak coherently. Others showed signs of complete memory loss, and some appeared to have suffered psychological breaks so severe that they no longer recognized family members or responded to their own names. The 7 mistresses were arrested on federal charges including conspiracy, murder, torture, fraud, and crimes against the constitutional rights of American citizens. Their trials conducted in Jackson, Mississippi during the spring and summer of 1848 attracted national and international attention as details of their systematic cruelties shocked even observers accustomed to the brutalities of slavery. The courtroom proceedings provided a forum for survivors to tell their stories, creating a public record of the conspiracy's crimes that could not be suppressed or denied. Marcus Washington's widow testified about her husband's journal and the systematic destruction of her family. Samuel Fletcher, permanently disabled by his ordeal but alive, described the torture techniques and the network of corruption that had protected the conspiracy. Dr. Carey provided medical testimony about the sophisticated nature of the injuries he had observed and treated. However, justice proved frustratingly elusive due to the defendants' enormous wealth, political connections, and the systemic corruption that pervaded Southern legal institutions. The women's families retained the finest legal representation available, including former senators, governors, and federal judges, who argued that the government lacked jurisdiction over internal plantation affairs and that the defendants had been operating within their legal rights as property owners. More troubling was the support they received from prominent Southern intellectuals, politicians, and even some Northern businessmen who argued that their methods, while extreme, represented innovative approaches to social control that could benefit society. Several university professors testified as character witnesses, praising the women's intelligence and dedication to advancing human knowledge. Medical professionals described their techniques as potentially valuable contributions to understanding mental illness and behavioral disorders. The trials resulted in outcomes that satisfied no one and demonstrated the limitations of legal justice in cases involving systematic crimes by wealthy and powerful defendants. Charlotte Vandenberg and Elena Dabney, identified as the conspiracy's primary leaders, received sentences of 20 years in federal prison, but served only 7 years before receiving presidential pardons following intensive lobbying by Southern political leaders. Victoria Pembroke and Constance Vanderhoor were sentenced to 15 years imprisonment, but were released after 5 years due to claimed health problems that were likely fabricated by sympathetic physicians. The remaining 3 conspirators, Isabella Fairfax, Henrietta Hawthorne, and Lucinda Belmont, avoided prison sentences entirely through legal maneuvering and political influence, receiving only substantial fines and prohibitions on owning enslaved people that were largely ignored once federal attention moved to other matters. Perhaps most troubling was the fate of the conspiracy's victims. The enslaved people who survived the correctional circle's experiments were so psychologically damaged that most could not function independently, even after being legally freed, as part of the federal intervention. Many remained on or near the plantations where they had been tortured, living in conditions barely distinguishable from their previous bondage because they lacked the psychological capacity to imagine or pursue alternative lives. The specialized torture facilities were officially ordered to be destroyed, but several were simply sealed and abandoned rather than demolished. Local rumors persisted for decades about continued activities at these locations, suggesting that the conspiracy's methods and perhaps some of its participants continued operating in secret long after the official exposure and prosecution. Inspector Hartwell never fully recovered from his experiences in the Natchez district. The physical injuries from the attack on the Natchez Trace healed, but the psychological trauma of witnessing systematic human destruction remained with him for the rest of his life. He resigned from federal service in 1849 and devoted his remaining years to documenting the case, locating other victims, and attempting to prevent similar conspiracies from developing elsewhere. His comprehensive reports, initially sealed by government order for reasons of national security and public safety, provided detailed documentation that later researchers would use to understand the full scope of the conspiracy. The reports were not declassified until 1963, more than a century after the events they described, and even then, many sections remained redacted to protect information that officials considered too sensitive for public release. The correctional circle's influence extended far beyond its immediate victims and the antebellum period. The psychological manipulation techniques developed by the Seven Mistresses were secretly studied by military intelligence agencies, prison administrators, and social control theorists throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Elements of their methods can be traced through various government and academic programs designed to manage difficult populations, including Native American boarding schools, immigrant processing centers, and even some modern interrogation techniques. Most disturbing is the substantial evidence suggesting that similar conspiracies operated simultaneously in other regions throughout the antebellum South. Correspondence found among the Natchez women's papers referenced active contacts in Georgia, South Carolina, Virginia, Alabama, and Louisiana who were implementing comparable programs. The full scope of systematic torture disguised as plantation discipline may never be fully known, as much of the evidence was successfully destroyed or remains hidden in private family archives. The Natchez district itself never recovered from the scandal surrounding the conspiracy's exposure. Several of the grand mansions were abandoned as their owners fled to avoid further prosecution or social ostracism. The region's reputation for wealth, refinement, and southern hospitality was permanently stained by associations with the conspiracy's horrors. Property values declined, legitimate businesses relocated, and the area entered a period of economic decline that lasted for generations. Yet even today, more than 175 years after these events, some local historians and community leaders continue to minimize or rationalize what occurred, suggesting that the accounts were exaggerated by Northern abolitionists for political purposes or that the women's actions, while regrettable, were understandable products of their time and circumstances. This persistent denial reflects the enduring power of the social and economic systems that made such systematic cruelty possible. The truth about the correctional circle serves as a permanent reminder that human cruelty can reach depths that challenge comprehension, particularly when it is systematized, rationalized, and conducted by educated, sophisticated individuals who convince themselves of their moral and intellectual superiority. The women of Natchez used their considerable intelligence, resources, and social positions not to elevate humanity, but to perfect methods for its degradation, creating a legacy of horror that continues to resonate through American history. Their conspiracy also demonstrates how wealth, social position, and political connections can protect even the most heinous criminals from appropriate justice, and how systematic oppression can be disguised as scientific progress or social improvement. The techniques they developed for destroying human dignity and identity were not aberrations, but logical extensions of the belief systems that supported slavery and other forms of systematic dehumanization. This mystery shows us that the most dangerous monsters in human history are often those who appear most civilized, educated, and respectable to their contemporaries. The capacity for evil exists not just in obviously disturbed individuals, but in ordinary people who convince themselves that their superior status justifies treating others as objects for experimentation and exploitation. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed about the Natchez District conspiracy, or might other secrets remain buried in those grand mansions along the Mississippi River? Could similar systematic cruelties have occurred in other regions without ever being discovered or documented? Leave your comment below and share your thoughts about this dark chapter in American history. If you enjoyed this tale and want more horror stories like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves dark historical mysteries. See you in the next video. See you in the